Hello. My name is Ines Katzenstein. I'm a curator of Latin American art here at MoMA and director of the Cisneros Institute. Welcome to Sur Moderno, New Perspectives on South American Abstraction and its Legacies, a symposium that we have organized in conjunction with the exhibition Sur Moderno, which is on view upstairs in the third floor galleries until March 15. This conference, which will take place today at MoMA and tomorrow at Columbia University, has been organized in collaboration with Professor Alexandra Alberro and the department, from the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia. This evening will feature the first round of conversations, and tomorrow we will meet at 1 p.m. at the Lantern at Columbia University Lemfer Center for the Arts for a full afternoon of presentations. I hope you can join us for both days for what we expect to be an exciting program. Before introducing our first panel, I would like to briefly share with you some of the ideas behind the exhibition Sur Moderno, as well as the goals of this symposium. The exhibition, which I've curated in consultation with Argentine scholar Marita Garcia and MoMA curatorial assistant Karen Grimson, had various objectives. First, it celebrates the gift that MoMA trustee Patricia Phelps de Cisneros and her husband Gustavo generously donated to the museum in 2016, which includes almost 150 works by artists from South American countries where the language of constructive abstraction flourished more prominently, a gift that has already radically improved MoMA's ability to narrate the history of modern art. Second, the exhibition wants to emphasize the connections between the different artistic groups working in Latin America, suggesting dialogues between their works whenever possible. In order to do so, we chose to avoid chronological or geographical narratives and complement the presentation of more than 80 works from the gift with documents such as magazines, flyers, and manifestos that help highlighting the existing yet understudied exchange among these groups. This selection of documentary materials has also allowed us to consider issues of design and public space, as well as shedding lights on the relationship between avant-garde groups and vernacular traditions, among other topics. In order to reveal the existing connections between South American modern art and canonical accounts of the history of abstraction, we included 7 works by European artists. Max Biel, Mondrian, Rodchenko, Puny, Van Tongerlo, Van Desburg, and Jan Tanguy are positioned as insertions in an otherwise entirely Latin American survey, functioning as either historical or contemporaneous reference of the South American artist. The symposium that begins today proposed to engage in a collective reflection on questions that might not appear as central to the exhibition, but that informed the curatorial process and that we consider crucial in order to continue framing the arrival of these works in MoMA's collection. The questions that are at the core of these symposiums have to do mostly with the present. How are the new ideas, research, and agendas of contemporary scholars changing and expanding the understanding of Latin American modernism? And furthermore, how are Latin American artists relating to and thinking today about the aesthetic and intellectual legacies of kinetic and concrete art? To grapple with these issues, we have invited a group of distinguished scholars, curators, and artists who in their work are reassessing key aspects of South American modern movements by implementing contemporary theoretical tools. We invited them specifically because they establish new connections between past and current discussions, featuring prominently, but not exclusively, topics of gender, race, and environment, and thus revealing histories and materials that have remained overlooked. We will begin the symposium with a very special guest, Paulo Herkenhoff, who has been one of the most important curators in shaping the project of the Cisneros collection. Herkenhoff will speak about his work with the collection throughout the 90s, as well as how his most recent projects have transformed his aesthetic vision. Following his presentation, he will be joined by Glenn Laurie, director of MoMA, for a conversation. Our second panel, moderated by scholar Mónica Amor, features two speakers, Lisa Blackmore, one of the leading specialists working in Latin American art from an eco-critical perspective, and Sur Moderno consulting curator Marita Garcia, who will expand on ideas of the relationship between the avant-garde and the vernacular, which he began exploring in the exhibition. After the break, we will present 3 short, informal videos by the artists Rosana Paulino, Fernanda Gomez, and Marcelo Pombo about their relationship to concrete art. States a highly critical interpretation of concrete art in relationship to the majority and the multiplicity of Brazilian art, Gomez embraces modernity as the possibility to affirm in the present the autonomous value of the image. Marcelo Pombo, one of the most lucid representatives of the 90s generation in Argentina, will elaborate on how his position regarding the concrete tradition has shifted in light of the specific developments of Latin America. Immediately following these videos, the British artist Isaac Julien will close the day with a presentation of his work Lina Bo Bardi, A Marvelous Entanglement, an homage to the Italian-born Brazilian architect. And now, some acknowledgments, important. I want to thank all the participants, many of whom has traveled from far away, for sharing their expertise, which continues to give relevance and complexity to one of the most vibrant episodes in the history of Latin American modern art. I also want to thank Monica Moore and Irene Small, both of whom contributed wonderful essays to the exhibition catalog of the show, and have generously agreed to continue their engagement as panel moderators today and tomorrow. I would also like to acknowledge and thank Marita Garcia and Alexander Alberro for their critical contributions in making this conference possible, Maria del Carmen Carrion, project manager of the Cisneros Institute, Madeline Turner, our fellow, Wendy Woon, Adelia Gregori, Jess Van Nostrand, and their entire team of MoMA Education Department for their hard work in producing this program. And also to Pablo Helguera for contributing his selection of Latin American music to help us refresh during the break. Last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to Patty Cisneros for her unwavering support and for being the inspiring force behind this entire project. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Glenn Lowry, Director of the Museum of Modern Art, and let me join Inez in welcoming all of you. It's a thrill to have you here. This is a symposium that we have long been waiting for, and I'm extremely excited to engage in the conversation over the coming 2 days with all of you. I want to, first of all, acknowledge Inez herself. You have been an extraordinary addition to the Museum of Modern Art as the founding director of the Cisneros Institute, and you've done an outstanding job in launching the Institute's programs and, more importantly, in working with your colleagues in bringing together such an extraordinary exhibition as Sur Moderno. So, Inez, we owe you an enormous debt of gratitude. To Patty, of course, none of this would be here without you, so you've heard me say this before, but I will say it again and again and again. We are profoundly and deeply and eternally grateful to you for your vision, your friendship, your commitment, and above all, for this extraordinarily generous gift. I want to just recognize 2 very special friends who are here tonight. Gabriel Perez Barreo, who was a co-conspirator with us in bringing this collection to the Museum of Modern Art and to some of the thinking behind it. So Gabriel, it's always great to see you here. And to a very dear friend, Luis Perez Oramas, who was for many years involved not only with the Cisneros collection, but who was also the curator of Latin American art here. Luis, I see you in the back. Would you just stand up so we could say how deeply grateful we are to you for the many, many brilliant exhibitions you brought to this institution. But now it's my pleasure to welcome another great friend, someone who actually introduced me to many of the critical issues in Latin American art. Paulo Herkenhoff. Paulo. Paulo hardly needs an introduction, but I'll give you just a kind of top-line introduction. It sort of sets the stage for the breadth of his thinking. He's an independent curator and critic. From 2013 to 2016, he was the artistic director of the Rio Art Museum in Rio de Janeiro. He also served as director of the National Museum of Fine Arts in Rio from 2003 to 6. As an adjunct curator here at the Museum of Modern Art in the Department of Painting and Sculpture from 1999 to 2002. Critical years at the museum. Paulo, I know that often you may have felt that there were battles to be fought about the presence of Latin American art, and there were, and they were good ones, and they were important ones. And I hope as you look across the institution today, you can see that the seeds you sowed back then have really borne fruit. And we'll hear more about that, and we'll talk about that. Paulo also was the chief curator of the Museum of Modern Art in Rio from 1985 to 1990, and the artistic director of the 24th Sao Paulo Biennale in 1998, an exhibition that I still remember as one of the most extraordinarily beautiful biennales, along with Gabrielle's, to have taken place. So you just begin to get a sense of the breadth of Paulo's interests. Today, he is, along with Helena Nader, the Olavo Setúbal Chair of Art at Sao Paulo University. He works on, actually, Chair of Art, Science, and Culture. My goodness, Paulo, you keep expanding the breadth of your interests. And he's produced an endless array of exhibitions. He was instrumental in working with us on an anthology of critical Brazilian texts that we produced through primary documents. And most importantly for tonight, he has been instrumental in the creation of the Cisneros collection, was a partner with Patty in its shaping and formation. So Paulo, for all of the work you've done, we are so grateful you've taken a moment to be with us tonight. Paulo Herkenhoff.
Before I start to speak, I show you this instrument. It's to wake you up if my voice is too makes you sleep, and to cut my tongue in case I speak more than I should. So here is my instrument. I would like to express my appreciation to Patty and Gustavo for this opportunity to work with this invention of a continent, of a subcontinent, to express the generosity of the words, my appreciation for the generosity of the words of Glenn Lowry about myself, express also my appreciation for the people for the Institute, and I thank you all for your presence here. I start with the Pico Phelps landscape in Caracas. This landscape in the 60s, when Venezuela and Brazil discussed the boundaries, this was decided that belonged to Brazil. It then became to be thought as the highest peak in Brazil. This is the 60s. This impressed so much the young Cildo Meirelles that he developed a vertical boundary in mutation, geographic mutation. He took this small stone from a deep part of Brazil and took it to the Phelps peak to make Brazil higher. And why Phelps? Because Patty's grandfather, no? He was the first explorer of this peak. That's why he has his name there. Bird watching. Bird watching is about a sense, a sensibility, a special sensibility. To be the peak, the highest peak of Brazil, today it's no longer considered. I think it was the challenge that Patricia Cisneros took when doing the collection, to elevate art history, to elevate the understanding of Latin America and especially South American. But also that Patricia has near in that region of the Amazonia, she has a piece of land for the Yanomamis to have peace. And she collected, and she even collected herself objects from material culture of some groups there from the Orinoco-Parima complex in the Amazonia. Patti is a collector of collections. She collects collections. Orinoco, design, contemporary art, landscape of Latin America, and she has even a collection of gardens. I know of the Hutchinson Museum in California, they have a collection of gardens, and the Queen Elizabeth. Very few people have collections of gardens. And Cisneros has two gardens of burle marx. And that's the design for the Parque del Este in Caracas. The person who invited burle marx to Caracas was the father of Gustavo Cisneros. So we are speaking about culture, and today Patti was saying that she raised in this Caracas of modernity with all those artists, constructive artists. And I was thinking, okay, she has a geometric abstract, a mathematical unconscious. No? I think that I was trying to understand the meaning of the Cisneros initiative at MoMA. I believe the first revolution regarding art of Latin America was Alfred Barr. He collected whatever he understood as what should be collected. He sent Lincoln Kirstein to South America with all the mistakes, the misleading that the Communist Party did at the occasion, forgetting Tarsila and remembering all the communist artists. He developed the idea of the self-taught artists as a possibility of a dialogue with surrealism and with a broader universe of artists, etc. And I would say the second revolution regarding the real discovery, the real engagement with Latin American art in the world was Patti initiating in the early 90s with the acquisition and donation of the first Oiticica. From that point on, she started the cultural war, which was the idea that these museums should incorporate Latin American art in its historiography. I need to read now a little bit, not too long, so it won't sleep so deeply, and my scissor can work. I would like to start regarding Mrs. Cisneros' collection, to think of Blaise Pascal, géométrie est l'art de persuader. But Cisneros collects with esprit de géométrie et esprit de finesse. The spirit of geometry is this idea that Latin America has an alternative, a rational alternative. This continent of turmoil, social injustice, corruption, banana republics, is also able to work under a constructive social perspective which includes aesthetics, and with education, through education, art is for all. L'esprit de géométrie is this capacity to be very rational, focused, decisive regarding what to collect. Everyone thinks you are destined only to the best, but many are called to the table of the best, as in the Bible, and very few really can sit at that point. And so the achievements is about the esprit de géométrie in the art itself, but also in the way of collecting. And the esprit de finesse is this capacity of relating to the other, of having a good relationship with artists, with curators, with the market, with society. And with the support of Glenn Lowry, she developed strategies of conquest. First, to buy a collection, to have this amount of works, this group of works that could prove by themselves the potency of this art. Then she started to contaminate. A librarian for the library, opening traveling trips for curators, giving a grant in Bard College so the students there, for a Latin American artist, so the students there could have a contact with Latin American curators. And once, something which was in a way impossible to do was to start to rewrite art history, invite people to rewrite what they have done. Wake up, Marisa. I'm kidding, just to and so I think this is, I make it shorter, no? And through that collection, she was able to establish this collection and this Latin American museum called MoMA, with the Institute Patricia Cisneros. This is a Latin American museum nowadays. This is Latin American territory. Okay, so I had a dream in the 80s which I did not realize. I wanted to make a collection of constructive Latin American art in the Museum of Modern Art in Rio. That was not possible. But that idea never left my mind until I found my sister's soul. Someone had to do it somewhere, but to do at MoMA, the canonical museum in the world, a museum that's unsurpassed. I have seen many museums from inside in terms of the rigorous historiography. It's an example of how to deal with art. And for instance, if we take Lygia Clark, I separated Lygia Clark in 22 stages. She's the adventure of space. The suprasensorial space, infrasensorial space, comes from the outside and goes into the internal aspects. And we have here a collection. Cisneros put together some 16 stages, and MoMA acquired some others. If I can give any suggestion, MoMA needs maybe 3 pieces to be the uttermost history of Lygia Clark anywhere. No? And so there is the invention of the discovery of the organic line. Between the frame and the canvas, there is a void space, which is dark and graphical. So there is a continuity between the line she draws and the line. But this organic line holds the air that we breathe and make the work as a collection of plans that comes individually. Now it's joined, this idea of putting together. And this is the counter-relief. There is a reference to the Russian avant-garde, but it's the putting the planes on top of the other. But there are 2 points that you have to look through, from the front and from the side. Then you discover a wonder of lines. The void, the linea organica, you find the line of light, and you find the dark line. The next moment that I want to present you are the bichos, the 2 on the left side, which are a group of plans that are joined, and you are supposed to manipulate. The work is unrealized until someone invests energy and desire, libido, to move it around. But that one, o dentro e o fora, is an Einsteinian work. She's interested in duration at this moment, from Bergson, attempt to interpret the personal meaning of time in terms of Einstein's physics. But this one has the Möbius strip structure, which was fundamental in Latin American art, and it is this continuity between I, myself, and the exterior world. A scissor has other possibilities. This is the most brilliant page in my discourse, what I'm going to show you. Look how brilliant. And you can just make a strip. Where is the Scotch tape? I forgot it downstairs. And here we do a Möbius strip. It's an exteriority that becomes the inside, and then it becomes the outside. For Lacan, this is the continuity between I, myself, and the other. And everyone should do his or her own, I mean, it should be glued, forgive me. And don't look at me. Do your own Möbius strip. This is not to be watched. This is to be lived. And then comes Willys de Castro, a sculpture there. If Richard Serra said in the 60s that sculpture was verb, he said in the 50s that sculpture is 2 verbs. Take a plan and you bend. And 3-dimensional space is starts, is born. When Serra went to Rio, he was really engaged with Amilcar. He loved Amilcar. I will disobey the time limits because I am following Glenn's advice. And here we have Oiticica. On the left side, it's a 1958 metaschema from the family that Patti donated to this museum in the early 90s. Here's a body. The color has an embodiment, and in the center is a parangolé, which means a collection of materials creating those objects to be worn. And I believe that the Patti is wearing an imaginary parangolé since 1992, when she used that one at the Projeto Oiticica. She left the place wearing the parangolé and went downtown in Rio, dancing with the parangolé around. Here's the book of Curation. I speak very quickly. It's a book it's circular. The first pages is the waters went down. Let's talk about that open white triangle. It's a void. It's the submarine. I don't know whether she was influenced by the submarine, the German submarine that sunk Brazilian ships during the war in her childhood, or whether it was Disney's 20,000 underwater miles, no? But that's the creation, not an act only of God, but an act of mankind, of humanity. And finally, the last one is the Fiat Lux. So we make it's biblical, no? I'm moving wrongly. This was my trick when I was at MoMA. At MoMA 2000 was this possibility to organize a show. I arrived here in the beginning of October. I had to open the show in February, about the 60, from the 40 to the 60. And I decided to put Frank Stella's The Marriage of Reason and Scholar, which is 59, and that Lygia Clark, which is prior to 59, but I was not so sure of the dates. So very conservatively, and not to offend the artist, I put 59 as a gesture of to be delicate. And someone thought, oh, I did not know Sarah did studies for this. Stella did studies for this painting. I said, neither do I. Okay. And then this person said, oh, but Stella did not see this artist. Okay. And that's the Lygia Clark law. The artists from the north, they have the benefit of not knowing. The art of the south, they would be derivative. That's the law of Lygia Clark. Amilcar de Castro. Maybe one of the great loves of Mrs. Cisneros. I need some water. And Mrs. Cisneros. The left one was the first moment of seduction between Willys and Patti. It's a active object of neoconcrete. Neoconcretism is about, among other things, the senses, a kind of non-Euclidean geometry sometimes, but about subjectiveness. In the work of Amilcar, everything that the artists have done is there. There is nothing that is disguising this structure. It's there, it's cutting and bending. And here we have to move around the work to understand and to find different combinations that he has done. This is 180, the first one, the vertical one, is the 180 degrees to circulate. The block, the cube, is all over, all the space. That's the yellow one is the first one. It was painted in the board. And this is the only object of center that was donated in honor of Kathy Halbreich, which makes me wonderfully happy because she supported me while I was here, and she has supported Patty and Glenn in their plans to bring the world to this museum. What is here cannot be repeated in any other museum because MoMA has the same amount of objetos ativos as all museums in Brazil together. And the only history. And here we move to the concrete artist of São Paulo. This is an artist that was born twice. First in 1922, from the womb of her mother, and then in 1999 or 2000, when Patty included her in the exhibition at the Fogg Museum. There she was announced for the world. There is a concrete artist like that. I'd like to say the following. Women made no contribution to Brazilian art. Think seriously about that. Women have constituted Brazilian art. If he said they contributed, we will be speaking about a main process where they will be adding the cherry of the cake. No, they were there. Ahead, like Lygia Clark, together, or a little bit behind, but they were always there. And this has been since the 19th century. The first exhibition in the world of photography as art was in Rio, because the emperor liked photography. 3 years after Daguerre announced photography in Paris. And then there was a certain Madame, French, exhibiting photography. But let me rush. So Judith Lawand is an invention of Cisneros' invention. Volpe, the same thing. He was included with one piece in every exhibition about Brazilian art, 2 pieces, but no one really looked at him. And the Cisneros collection made a statement at the Fogg. This is Rubem Valentim, a black artist who, after Jorge Amado and the group in Bahia that were dealing with the African tradition in a very exotic way, he said, no. Afro-Brazilian culture is not a question of police, as it was, because of the Catholic Church. It's not superstition. It's not exoticism. It is not folklore. It is a set of value like any religion. And Mário Pedrosa, which with J. Levinson was published as an anthology here, included these men as a family of religious artists, like Mira Schendel. And Derrida asks, can we pray if we do not know the language? The hierarchical, the totemic here. Can we understand this is spiritual? Now it's time to speak, I'm almost closing. Now it's time about the expansion of the Cisneros collection towards the south, with Argentina, with Maldonado and others. And here I have to speak of Gabriel Pérez Barreiro, who was one of the two advisors to the formation of this collection. He had made his dissertation on Ardent Queen and helped us to go with a certainty in this muddy territory of falses and antedated works that were done that very new. Then I move, to conclude, to Venezuela. On the right side, Soto is the work in the collection of Ariel Jimenez. 70 works. Every day he discovered a small differences. And part would say, where this guy is going to take me with Soto? No? But that taught us that Lygia Clark should be collected in depth, that Oiticica should be collected in depth. This was a big lesson. And then we have Gego, this nothingness, this work of scraps. Because art, that's Mario Pedrosa again, art is a force then that can reverse entropy, social entropy. And that's what Gego did. And I think that here we have to talk of Luis Pérez Orama, who corrected my presence in this museum. He was more active, he was more diplomatic, he was not so homesick, etc. And I used to say that I lived in Rio, and every week I would travel to New York and spend 45 days. So that was my feeling. And he was able to make a beautiful group of Gego, as he did many contributions. And I think one of his major aspects was to really accept the space that MoMA was opening. Glenn mentioned the nice exhibitions that he did, without asking excuse, with no fear, but doing. And to finish, I would say that Gustavo and Patty, they have accomplished what they wanted to do. If it's a second moment of art history, Latin American art history, there are other things that are happening nowadays. The collection might have new challenges. The Institute will do what John Elderfield always said, that we should put in the museum an institute what would be a permanent process of deep study of Latin American art. I think the canon has broadened it, and my appreciation to all of you here. Thank you. Thank you. Let me sit there because of my eye. Otherwise, I would not see you. Thank you.
So that was fantastic, Paulo, but I see Inez twitching here because she is a taskmaster of the schedule. But She knew going into this that one of the great pleasures of working with you, Paulo, is that when you catch flight, you take off and bring us to places that we didn't even know we would go. So you have us cutting Moebius strips, you have us thinking of you as a performance artist, but much more importantly, you have us in your grip with your deep knowledge and love of Latin American art. But I want to ask...
And MoMA.
Well, I want to ask you a question about that. So we're going to talk for a few minutes, and Inez, we are going to get back on track. But you came up to see me a couple of days ago, and it was, as always, a reunion of pleasure. But you said to me something that you haven't said to me in almost 20 years. You said, I'm at peace with MoMA. And I wonder what you meant by that.
Do you know, it was very generous of you to invite me, of Patty to bring me, but I don't know if it was too painful to leave Rio, to leave my house. But when the invitation came to me at the Biennale, it came by fax, and people read it. And when I arrived, the voice was around, and I said, I have no choice anymore. It would be too uneducated to say that I refused it. But it really, for me, it was very hard to leave Rio. I have my house, I have my books. Now I'm writing a text that the man who lost his library in his house, at the house, because there are so many books that I don't have anymore. But that's what was it hard? I don't think the curators of the museum were ready for the transformation that we need. We got the first alliances, like Roxana. It was very interesting the way she got interested in Latin America. She went to Latin America afterwards, and she knew the artists, etc. But I needed to go home. And I was invited to be the director of the... You invited me to be here longer, no? But I had been invited to be the director of the Museum of Fine Arts in Rio when Lula was elected. So I had a task. So that's what...
So let me turn to the Cisneros collection. And you must have had, as you began working with Patty, some idea, some model of what the collection could be. And so I'm interested in, one, the focus on concrete and neo-concrete art, the way in which, as the collection shaped itself, it became a collection about 4 places, and the degree to which that was a conscious decision, the degree to which it was a plan. You've answered that in part when you talked about Lygia Clark, but this collection has such character to it. I'm fascinated by how you inserted yourself into the shaping of that.
There is a history. In 1978, there was an exhibition in Rio called Geometria Sensível, the sensible geometry, with a large retrospective. I saw the exhibition, the opening night. The following day, a fire destroyed the museum and the exhibition. And 5 years later, I was invited to work there to reconstruct the museum. Eloise Richardelli was crucial for the I make an homage here to Eloise. The registrar at MoMA.
Former registrar at MoMA for many, many, many years.
Yes, and she was also very important for the Biennale as well. And when I went to the museum, I found we have to find a way to reconstruct this museum, and we have a moral responsibility towards Latin America. In the very beginning, in the very first months of when I was there, I went to Buenos Aires to a conference of museums from ICON, and I had the chance to see the collection of Mr. Blaquier, of Madi, Concreta Invención, and others. I said, come on. These we have to go and do. And I tried to collect. It was impossible for political reasons. It's not interesting here. And then I went to Caracas, understood a little bit more with Rina Carvajal, was crucial at that moment, understood better what was. I visited the university, and I learned of the collection, the Cisneros collection. At that moment, Patty was not there, but she opened her house and told people to show me things. So I said, oh, come on, this is what we have to do, put everything together. I'm speaking of the 90s now, and I said, this is going to be done sometime in the future. I said to myself. And when I met Patty and we started to talk, and she was curious about what would be the corresponding artists in Brazil, the history, the precedent of the La Plata school in terms of Brazil, etc., I realized that that was the possibility. Gustavo was very generous. That was not his main interest, but he understood there was a meaning there. And he said, go. Insisted that we should go, gave all the means to do. And in the process, there is a fact which I think is fun, that sometimes we found objects that were so interesting, but Patty was not fond of. And I said, Patty, let's do something. Give us a chance to us curators. Let's create the Curators Mistakes Fund. We establish a limit, and within that limit we can have a voice. Because I think that in a museum like MoMA, trustees are the salt. A force that is very constructive almost all the time. I could see, for instance, Agnes Gand, her generosity during the period I was here. No? And so I said, oh, come on, she has everything in her hands. She has the means, she has the taste, the focus, the esprit de géométrie, no? And she has the desire. And that was an encounter which ended up here now.
I think that's a perfect way to sum up our conversation. There are going to be many more that unfold over this, but I can see Inez eager to come back to schedule, which we will do. But much more importantly, Paulo, the insights that you gave us as you were talking about your own thinking, about the way in which you read art, particularly from Brazil, but more generally, and the way in which that connects to Patty's interests and taste, lay the groundwork for what you generously said. I think you said it with a twinkle in your eye and perhaps a little humor, the reality that we have become the Latin American Museum. And to that we owe a great deal.
There is no choice.
I couldn't agree more, but we owe you a great deal of thanks for having helped get us there. Thank you, Paulo Herkenhoff.
Very generous. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to everyone that Inez already thanked, and to Inez. I'm just briefly going to introduce two speakers tonight as part of the program. Lisa Blackmore, who is the author of a very, very important book that became a Bible to many of us. It's called Spectacular Modernity, Dictatorship, Space, and Visuality in Venezuela, 1948-1958. And she's also the co-editor of Downward Spiral, El Helicoides Descent from Mall to Prison, and co-director of the research film Después de Trujillo. That was 2016. Lisa has lectured at universities in Venezuela and the UK, and has been a postdoctoral researcher in the University of Zurich, and currently she's at the University of Essex as lecturer in art history and interdisciplinary studies. Our second speaker is Maria Amalia Garcia, who is a researcher in Argentina's National Scientific and Technical Research Council. And that's part of TAREA, Cultural Patrimony Research Institute at the National University of San Martin. She teaches art history at the University of Buenos Aires, recently published in English, another very, very important book that had come out in Spanish first, and it has a very beautiful title. It's called Abstract Crossings, and is published by University of California Press. She also, prior to that, had contributed with the Cisneros Foundation in a very, very important series of books that are conversations with artists, and hers was with Tomás Maldonado. So please help me welcome our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica, and thank you to everyone who's put this event together. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening, and also quite frightening to follow Paulo, because I didn't know I had to bring props or jokes, but I do have videos, so I'm really hoping they'll carry me through. And just a note about that, there are going to be some clips that you'll see, and unfortunately we've had to kill the sound on them so that I can get through the talk. But it is a film that's online and available, so I'd encourage you to seek it out. It's a corporate film that was released in the late 70s, and that is about the hydroelectric plant that I'll be talking about this evening. So that's just an explanation of what you'll be missing but can catch up on afterwards. So the Institute and the exhibition Sur Moderno are really fostering exciting opportunities for these new dialogues that we're having around South America's living heritage of geometric abstraction and kinetic art. The material legacies of those movements are vital to our understanding of the present, not only in terms of contemporary art making, but also with regards to the broader project of modernity and its material impacts on the environment. So today, what I want to do is make a case for an eco-critical approach to cinetismo, kinetic art, by exploring its relation to hydroelectric infrastructure in Venezuela. So in the history of Venezuelan modernity, the city, and Caracas in particular, has played the starring role, to the detriment perhaps of other terrains. I've contributed in part to this story, as Monica just mentioned, by focusing in on this spectacle of modernist architecture and authoritarian politics that transformed Caracas in the 1950s. And really, it's little wonder that attention has been focused on the urban landscape, given the extreme makeover that it underwent in the mid-20th century, and the fact that artworks had literally leapt off gallery walls to become part of the circulatory flows of moving bodies, transport, capital, and commodities. Sur Moderno honors the importance of the urban landscape by showcasing, among other things, Carlos Raúl Villanueva's University City, which you're looking at here, which fused modern art and architecture. By the 1970s, the scale of kinetic art matched that of the urban landscape, flanking motorways, sprouting up in subway stations, as the city as kinetic artifact allegorized a nation on the move. So far, so urban, right, and familiar. And this is the city-centric account of modern aesthetics, as we know it. Equally familiar by now is the backlash against cinetismo and the related accusation that kinetic art was disconnected from the complexities of real life in the city, and in particular its unmissable urban poverty. The Sur Moderno catalogue recounts how artists like Jesus Soto and Carlos Cruz Diaz created vibration and instability in their artworks through, I quote, illusory images dematerialized and detached from the object. Illusory, dematerialized, detached. It's easy to see how these concepts might equate cinetismo to pure optics, and of course this is not what the catalogue is arguing. And to a blindness to the material urban phenomena that introduce stutters and detours in the metronome of modernity and its linear flow of unstoppable progress. But reducing kinetic art to visual trickery leaves us in a critical cul-de-sac, where cinetismo merely created an illusion of urban modernity, the jester, if you will, playing at the court of the magical state, to use Fernando Coronil's formulation for petropolitics. This exhibition and the symposium lay down important challenges for us in asking what new critical and theoretical frameworks offer fertile grounds to discuss kinetic art and the stuttering and irregular emplacement of modernity. My contention is that exploring kinetic art beyond the city introduces an environmental perspective that reframes the project of modernity not as failure or illusion, but as a very material imbrication of different times, places, and forms, all circulating in unpredictable flux, a phenomenon that we might continue to reckon with, that we must continue to reckon with, in its constant unfolding where remote ecologies create the ambient conditions of our material lives. Our attention is drawn to matter and ecological imbrication in this wonderful dialogue between indigenous basket work using entirely organic materials and Gergo's hybrid weave of paper and plastic packaging, the latter a byproduct of fossil fuel extraction. The dialogue between these works is a springboard I want to use to take us somewhere else, which is here. And we're eventually coming back, but first we have to make a detour. So as well as covering transport networks, in 1970s Venezuela, kinetic artworks were integrated into other infrastructural systems. They appeared as painted murals on the huge grain silos and river embankment walls, and as we'll see shortly, integrated into hydroelectric plants as industrial-sized sculptures and installations. The recent infrastructural turn in cultural anthropology has enriched discussions about the politics and poetics of infrastructure. So we're quite used to talking about architecture, right? But what do we say about infrastructure? The scholar Brian Larkin defines it as infrastructures as artifacts with conceptual roots in the Enlightenment idea of a world in movement and open to change and progress. He writes that they are built networks that facilitate the flow of goods, people, or ideas and allow for their exchange over space. They are ambient environments that determine the texture of life, its speed, temperature, light, even smell, enabling what Larkin calls a sensing of modernity. And this is particularly evident, of course, when infrastructures break down, short-circuiting living patterns. Infrastructures then are relational nodes that connect disparate matter and bodies across expansive ranges of time and space. They're circulatory environments where ancient matter is extracted, processed, and then powers contemporary lives. Hydroelectricity, which is my focus today, exemplifies this. Rivers are dammed to provide water to spin turbines. Electricity is fed into a national grid that enters homes. Lights come on, ovens fire up, dinner's served. Infrastructure links city and countryside, connecting our metabolizing bodies energetically to flowing rivers. We are, you might say, eating water, or perhaps becoming river. So my current research is all about liquid ecologies like these, and I'm interested in the role of rivers in cultural production, how artists, mainly in Latin America, but also more broadly, artists and poets signal the agencies of bodies of water, not as mere resources that humans can tap, but as physical and aesthetic forces in and of themselves. This research explores the relations between humans and nature by focusing on the history of hydropower and hydraulic infrastructures to consider how they transform physical landscapes and set in place temporal regimes and worldviews linked to the projects of urban and industrial modernity. Climate change and breakdowns in hydraulic infrastructures signal the limitations of human capacity to understand rivers, So I'm interested in the status of those worldviews and what other relations to water exist and are mediated by art. Dams affect 2/3 of our river basins, and their combined weight has literally shifted the axis of the earth, changing the speed of its rotation. How rivers are controlled is thus a major chapter in the history of the Anthropocene, the current geological era that recognizes humans as the main force of planetary change. So that's some background. But by now you're wondering what happened to the landscape I wanted to take you to. So we're back at the source of some of the rivers that feed into the mythical Orinoco Basin, deep in Venezuela's southeastern reaches, among the tabletop mountains born several million years ago. And we're going to travel a little further downstream to get back to kinetic art. So this is the first of these videos that I was mentioning. In the mid-20th century, the Venezuelan state began to industrialize the Orinoco Basin by creating a major hub for extractive industries in Ciudad Guayana. To power these industries and growing urban hubs, it built what was then the largest hydroelectric plant in the world, Guri, which still provides the country with 2/3 of its electricity when it's working properly. When it went online in the 70s, it was dubbed, as you can see here, in triumphant technocratic language, the giant of the Caroni, honoring the river Caroni, a major tributary of the Orinoco, whose flow was dammed to spin Guri's turbines. Edelca, the state hydroelectric company, commissioned the artists Carlos Cruz Diez and Alejandro Otero to design immense kinetic artworks for Guri. Cruz Diez worked on the 2 engine rooms, each producing works for spaces that were more than 200 meters long, and Otero created a work for the Plaza de la Democracia, Democracy Square, a landscaped area located on the edge of the concrete embankment wall. So left to its own devices, a river is a sculptor that works tirelessly. Born in Angel Falls and fed by the Cucanan, Araopo, and Urani rivers as it moves through the Gran Sabana's ancient tabletop mountains, the Orinoco Basin and its main river flows over 1,700 miles, molding the land as it moves and carrying 52 million tons of sand that year on year the Caroni carried toward the ocean before it was dammed. Seen in this way, if rivers are continually sculpting the land, embankment dams are outsized earthworks that inhibit this process. Infrastructural and extractive landscapes dramatize the counterpoint between nature and culture, geology and humanity. They remind us of Robert Smithson's eloquent statement that the strata of the earth is a jumbled museum. If we cut a cross-section through the earth, we don't see an entirely chronological formation, but multiple times mixed together. Is what Smithson's saying. Human industry moves the earth's sediments around, mining, transforming matter, circulating it into other forms, then throwing them away. Even before art is created for industrial landscapes, as Smithson wrote, their formation, quote, evades the rational order and social structures that confine art. So Guri, Cruz Diez, and Otero's works are artifacts in the jumbled museum, inaugurated with the industrialization of the Orinoco. Understood as part of a circulatory landscape, these works invite us not to bracket the environment outside of discussions of modern aesthetics, but to consider it within an assemblage of spatio-temporal interventions initiated by the project of industrial modernity in the contact zones it's generated between deep geological time, extracted matter, energy production, urban culture, and modern art. In short, these kinetic artworks show us how modernity intersects campo y ciudad, nature and culture. These aren't distinct categories or places. Like Gego's weaving of paper and plastic, they're profoundly entangled. So there's no time for in-depth analysis today, but I want to go a little bit deeper into each work in the time I've got left. In Engine Room 1, Cruz Diez designed physiochromatic murals that unfurled along the walls and chromatic structures that capped each of the 10 turbines below. In Engine Room 2, he took a similar approach, but incorporated metal panels in relief on the murals, a taller variant of the circular chromatic structures, and installed a chromosaturation at the end of the hall, where a light bulb would change from red to green to blue, slowing down this constant process of creating colour that so fascinated him. As they generate flows of vibrating colour, the murals offer a visible allegory for the invisible process that occurs as the gates are opened and water starts to spin through the turbines. The scale of these works maps onto that of the cutting-edge machinery of energy production, bringing cinetismo into the realm that David Nye has called the technological sublime. And fittingly for a work that intersects art and infrastructure, the chromatic environments combine the two meanings of the term abstraction that bridges the fields of aesthetics and hydraulics. In Cruz Diaz's works, water is rendered abstract in these flows, vibrating, as it's represented non-figuratively in an infrastructural environment where liquid flows are being extracted from the river. For Alfredo Boulton, writing in Art in Guri, published in the 80s, quote, "The powerhouses and the large machines are testimonial symbols that, honoring the ancient mystical sites, greet the visitor at the entrance to this brave new world. The hydropower complex is a man-made monument that matches the solidity and grandeur of the massifs of the Gran Sabana. Put another way, concrete monumentality emulates geological majesty, creating a landscape that is presented as material proof of human and national progress." Boulton's reading is of its time and fits the context of his publication. Art in Guri was produced, after all, to pay homage to the power plant when serious questions had not yet been raised about megadam construction and hydropower. It also reflects faith in human capacity to predict hydrological futures before debates about climate change had really taken root. Now, however, human mastery of nature is a paradigm in crisis. Recent droughts have almost shut down Guri, creating blackouts that have plunged Venezuela into darkness for days on end. In the reservoir, the sediments of the jumbled museum re-emerged to transform the landscape and the texture of daily life. Site specificity doesn't just describe a design process for a particular place. It designates the way spatial flux constantly invigorates an artwork's afterlife. The chromatic environments are far from the autonomous color, freed from anecdotal qualities that Cruz Diaz identified as pillars of his practice. Guri's hydrology shapes their meanings on its terms, creating a counterpoint between linear vibrating color and the slow horizontal accretion of geological sediment. Sedimentation of suspended particles, we might say, is a form of ultra-slow motion kinetic art that sometimes becomes visible in ephemeral artworks made by the river itself. The convergence of these different tempos invites us to look at Cruz Diaz's work anew as a metronome of modernity thrown off kilter by climate change. And to Otero. Alejandro Otero's Torre Solar comprises two rings of rotating blades mounted atop a 50-meter-high concrete tower, clad in 57 tons of melted steel, a material that was a nod to one of the main state industries in Ciudad Guayana. Like the ones buried in the engine rooms, the Torre Solar is also a turbine, but one spun by air, not by water, and whose blades reflect the changing colors of the sky as they rotate like an earthbound satellite. The sculpture was placed next to the concrete spillway in the Plaza La Democracia, designed by Domingo Alvarez and surrounded by large red granite rocks. I'm going to go back so you can see them. Surrounded by large granite rocks, typical of the landscape that Guri so drastically altered. Torre Solar also opens to temporal regimes that problematize its simplistic interpretation as a monumental ode to progress through the counterpoint between its concrete structure and the granite rubble that sits at its base. So today, scientists have agreed that concrete is going to be the most abundant anthropogenic, man-made sedimentary rock on the planet. Okay, it's going to be what we leave behind us. Humanity's most significant trace fossil. So concrete structures then are ruins in waiting, which will be outlived by enduring granite, the bedrock of the ancient landscape where the artwork was installed. Seen in this context, the self-consciously modern materials in Otero's work foretell their own obsolescence, an obsolescence that is in geohistorical terms imminent, and makes the Torre Solar and Guri future fossils of the Anthropocene and the Earth's Jumbled Museum. So I don't wish to reframe Otero as an eco-critical artist, but his sensitivity to non-human energy flows is notable. In 1967, he had written that, and I quote, "Vibrations, transparencies, flows of water, for example, do not suggest to me a form or series of forms, but the alphabet and syntax of form." In Torre Solar, he embraced wind. There we go. He embraced wind as a co-creator of sculpture, allowing its speed to determine the turbine's circulation and thus opening form to meteorological non-human forces. In this opening to the volatility of wind, the artwork articulates rhythms distinct from the regulated tempo and harness flows that underpin the modern project and life in industrial and urban modernity. This then, to sum up, is the conclusion that can be drawn for both of the works that I've discussed today. For all their high-tech appearance, Crustiers and Otero's installations need not be necessarily viewed as infrastructural monuments, whose meanings are foreclosed and historicized as mere hydraulic hubris, a mirror to the spectacle of modernity playing out in the city. Rather, their opening to specific ecologies, whose waters rise and recede and winds flurry and fade, reframes kinetic artworks as an unpredictable becoming, born of the assemblage of industrial and natural forces that characterizes the Orinoco and the Anthropocene more broadly. Apprehended in the imbrications of circulatory environments, the vibrating forms of kinetic art are certainly not illusory, dematerialized, or detached. Quite the contrary. Their permeability to fluctuating currents and embeddedness in specific sites situates them as real, material interlocutors with the turbulences of the history of modernity and the challenges of our ecological present. Thank you very much.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure for me to share this panel with Monica Mora and Lisa Blackmore. And I want to thank Ines Katzenstein for this invitation. And my presentation is called Vernacular Readings of South American Abstraction from the 50s. This presentation offers a preliminary approach to something that, at the first glance, may appear contradictory. The combination of high modernism, represented by abstract art, and vernacular South American culture. I am particularly interested in mapping out the ties between autonomous visualities and images deeply rooted in a local culture. This regional reading of abstraction was one of the focal points of Sur Moderno exhibition, and today I would like to take that reading further. A comparative perspective will allow me to shed light on previously overlooked materials key to alternative narratives of abstract art. Some magazines published in South America in the early 50s took on the task of popularizing a modern lifestyle, informing the public about modern art, architecture, fashion, and music. The international modern vision was coupled, in some cases, with productions of native culture. In the first instance, I will take a cursory look at the magazine's Habitat from Sao Paulo, edited by Bo Bardi, and A, Hombre y Expresión, from Caracas, edited by Carlos Raúl Villanueva, in order to identify the coexistence of modern art and local culture. I hold that these magazines read the aesthetic constructed aspect of the vernacular from a modernist perspective, focusing on procedures such as synthesis, formal values, and material honesty. Secondly, I will address Buenos Aires-based magazines Nueva Visión, edited by Tomás Maldonado, and Conjugación de Buenos Aires, edited by Edgar Bailey and Juan Carlos Lamadrid, in order to challenge established views of Argentine concrete art. In the Argentine case, I argue that art history's reading of concrete art from Buenos Aires, and Tomás Maldonado specifically, has privileged the internationalist streak over vernacular concerns. I will start examining Habitat. With its first 10 issues edited by the Italian-Brazilian architect Lina Bo Bardi, Habitat was the publication platform of the Museu Giarchi de São Paulo. Habitat not only featured modern art and design by the European figures like Le Corbusier and Maxwell, but also images of contemporary folk and indigenous art and articles on Brazilian Baroque. In this way, Habitat shaped and articulated sensibility, tying modern forms and native culture together for the urban elites of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro. Habitat covers, which summarize the contents of each issue, are particularly revealing of the syncretic procedures. For example, the cover of the first issue, in a Mondrian-style grid, laid out details from houses designed by the architect of João Batista Villano Artigas, an armchair designed by Giancarlo Palanti, Pablo Picasso's portrait of Suzanne, Amazonian houses, and votive offerings for northeastern Brazil. The cover of the second issue reproduced an industrial complex by Oscar Niemeyer, along with a painting by Max Will and a folk ceramic craft. Thus, the magazine can be seen as an initial platform for Bo Bardi's project of demystifying modern design by exploring local traditions. Let us now turn briefly to A Hombre y Expresión, edited by Carlos Raúl Villanueva. The first two issues of A magazine are eloquent regarding the joining of abstract art and vernacular culture. The first issue, published in January 1954, included both an article about the development of abstraction in Venezuela by Mateo Manaure, and a text of indigenous Piura people that praised the integration of functionality and visual values in their constructions. Furthermore, Carlos Raúl Villanueva and designer Miguel Arroyo used the magazine to show the regional inspiration of their own modern productions. For example, Arroyo pointed out that he used indigenous and Creole furniture as a source of inspiration for the Pampatar armchair that he designed for Alfredo Bulton's house in Isla Margarita. In the second issue, Villanueva claimed that his own house in Caracas sought to overcome functionalism through a regionalist approach that connected adaptation to the climate with a colonial tradition. The interior decoration was also arranged according to a modern vernacular vision. Venezuelan indigenous masks and colonial carvings hung alongside pieces by Alexander Calder, Hans Arp, and Anton Pevsner. All in all, as I have pointed out, Habitat and A had a similar reading of the visual arsenal of native populations, namely one that valued how the material culture of those populations was tied to the modern paradigm. It is worth mentioning that at the same period that those magazines were undertaking the revitalization of the local cultures, the territorial control and exploitation of the Amazon region was taking place. In the case of Brazil, Habitat's revitalization ran parallel to the conquest of the country's western territory by the state and the deterritorialization of indigenous population. In the case of Venezuela, the 1950s witnessed the beginning of an intense exploitation of the Orinoco Basin for navigation, hydroelectric power, and mining. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, the study of these magazines led me to revisit the Argentine case. The closest equivalent to Habitat and A in terms of advocating the modern in the 50s is the magazine Nueva Visión, edited by Tomás Maldonado and launched in Buenos Aires in 1951. In Argentina, the spread of modern art was limited due to Juan Perón government, which did not support the modern aesthetic. In that context, the magazine made an effort to exhibit a wide and international panorama of modern art. Under the motto Synthesis of Art, the cover of the first issue showed Alvar Aalto, Max Bill, and Henri van de Velde as the pioneers of design. Nueva Visión represented a particular moment in the development of local concrete art. Although it was the era of the mythical magazine Arturo, published 7 years earlier, in 1944, there had been, in the interim, a significant change in direction. In Arturo, inventionism has emerged as a local rereading of avant-garde ideas in the Rio de la Plata. The local cutout frame and its pursuit of a non-representative structure had stood as a break with European legacy. In Nueva Visión, 7 years later, artists such as Maldonado, Alfredo Lito, and Lidi Prati gave up the cutout frame and returned to the rectangular frame. This change in position had been read, and here I include my own research on the subject, as a reorientation of Argentine concrete art in line with the international panorama. That said, the great difference between Nueva Visión on the one hand and Habitat and A on the other is the fact that in the Argentine magazine there is a complete absence of vernacular readings. But the detailed analysis of other journals launched by the inventionist artist reveals a more complex and plural panorama. The fact that Argentina had received great migratory waves and had an indigenous tradition less deeply rooted than other countries in the region does not mean there was no local culture in the city of Buenos Aires. In 1951, poets Edgar Bailey and Juan Carlos Lamadrid launched the magazine Conjugación de Buenos Aires. Both Bailey and Lamadrid under the pseudonym Simón Contreras, had actively participated in the inventionist avant-garde in the 40s. Conjugación de Buenos Aires, with its 3 issues printed on A3 newsprint, sans serif typeface, and without images, was materially simple but conceptually complex. In the first issue, the magazine stated, "It should come as no surprise that here we join together basic everyday life and concerns universal in scope. Testimonies of urban experience and ideas and work of the aesthetic avant-garde. That encounter of conjugation is part of our plan. We want to overcome a false antinomy for the sake of a real collective adventure." Conjugación de Buenos Aires furthered the experimentation with poetic language pursued by the inventionists during the 40s. As the editor stated, the magazine's primary mission was to blend the urban experience with ideas and work of the aesthetic avant-garde. That is, the magazine sought to mix tango and inventionism. Tango, as you may know, is a musical genre developed during the 19th century in the slums of Buenos Aires. The city at the time was undergoing a process of urban growth driven by a mass immigration. Tango was forged from the multi-ethnic contributions of Andalusian flamenco, Cuban habanera, candombe, milonga, and European polka. The search for a local avant-garde, for inventionist tango, was already underway in one of the magazines launched by the inventionist artists during the 40s. There, in a poetry supplement, Baile and La Madrid had published poems that experimented with the phonetic aspect of language, unexpected associations, and the destruction of logical sense. Also, surreptitiously, a phrase altering the conventional direction of writing appeared on the right margin. Signed by Contreras, it said, "Of all neo-realist representative art, the only thing that interests me is tango." That was the seed that would blossom in the magazine Conjugación de Buenos Aires 5 years later. The confluence of urban slang using tango lyrics and the international language of the avant-garde. La Madrid was probably the one who saw in tango the element capable of adding the popular imaginary to inventionism. He realized that the avant-garde experimentation could activate the poetic potential of tango and give the people better words. In an interview, La Madrid advocated putting an end to the stereotypical themes of tango. In La Madrid's words, the lie of selling trash to the people, the little street lamp, the love nest apartment, the blind alley, the chan-chan. During the 50s, the tango was in crisis. The little street lamp, el farolito, and other typical motif of tango had lost their original strength through repetition and trivialization on the radio and in movies. I want to share with you a short passage from a film Cuesta Abajo, in which Carlos Gardel, the most famous figure in tango, sings Mi Buenos Aires querido. It illustrates, I believe, the traditional tango that the magazine was trying to challenge.
El farolito de la calle en que nací, cuál sentinela de mis promesas de amor. Bajo su quieta lucecita yo la vi, a mi pebeta luminosa como un sol.
Baile and La Madrid were interested in exploiting the language of the avant-garde to sing to an international Buenos Aires, a city that was being filled with new music in English, a city where the traditional farolito had grown dim. Tango lyrics and music were being transformed by new mixtures and references, among them the experience of the avant-garde. Let us now see the combination between avant-garde and tango that Conjugación de Buenos Aires aspired to. The first issue of the magazine published a text by Tristan Tzara on Pierre Reverdit, and on the verso of the same page, the Tango Rosa Buenos Aires by La Madrid. This tango, dedicated to Julio de Caro, Aníbal Troilo, and Astor Piazzolla, recreated the atmosphere of Buenos Aires slums and underworld. The relationship between La Madrid and Piazzolla, expressed in the dedication, would lead the rhythmic transformation of the tango in the 60s. The growing complexity of the metaphor in the last verse of the Tango Rosa Buenos Aires shows La Madrid passage through the avant-garde. Una vez, nada más, el hombre vuelve sobre su soledad, el dinamismo que dramatiza cosas y lugares, a descifrar la adolescencia que devoraron los Galápagos. The sophisticated language of the avant-garde had become interwoven into the fabric of tango. Its transforming power rescued the national song from cliché and overused metaphors and restored the role of poems and poets in the formulation and in the formation of a new popular aesthetic consciousness. To conclude, I would like to revisit a few historiographic aspects. I have already pointed out that the regional comparative analysis makes it possible to identify episodes in the national art histories which had been previously disregarded. A fresh look at the magazine's habitat and a hombre y expresión, for instance, allowed me to re-examine the Argentine case through Nueva Visión and Conjugación de Buenos Aires, and to identify a hidden vernacular in the Argentine avant-garde. Tomás Maldonado's perspectives prevail in the reading of this period, thanks to its seductive arguments, theoretical soundness, and the artist's important international career. But relativizing Maldonado's roles required writing other histories of concretism. That is, deconstructing masculine canon of concrete art, revisiting the dogmas of invention for more playful and contradictory approaches, and discover the vernacular in places where there was only purity of forms. This rereading hopes to splash with muddy river waters what until now had been coated with polished white enamel. Thank you very much.
We don't have a lot of time, so we're going to use it effectively. And I cheated because I read those papers before. And so I prepare one question for each speaker. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to do these. I also aim to summarize a little bit with each question, and then we're going to open it up to the public. So Lisa, I want to ask you about the methodology we may use to study these artifacts that you're looking at. You seem to argue that if we see artworks as embedded in their material context, as these contexts evolve, change, and transform, then they may surpass, I think that's what your suggestion is, the materialism that informed their initial inception and reception. My own contribution to the catalog, which focuses on the urban, as you observe at the onset of your talk, calls for such contingent framework, one that rejects the universal chimera that los disidentes aspire to. Now, I'm sure that most of all of us will agree that urban space, too, is such a circulatory environment, to use a term from your lecture. I guess that what I'm trying to say or to ask is if your approach, which initially seems inspired by the recent turn towards the politics of ecology, is also not applicable to those kinetic works that inhabit the city. And here I think that there's a crucial exchange between the materiality of the works, foundational to their meaning. For example, Gego's welded ironworks partake of a collective imaginary launched by the steel industry that so colonized the infrastructural environments of Venezuela. And that one of those pieces actually is here in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And so there's an overlap between the materiality of those sculptures and or those works and the materiality of the environment. For example, the corrosive rain of the tropics or the absolute disregard for public art on the part of the government. So I wonder, it's a long question, right? So I wonder if we can unpack further the differences between discussing the Torre Solar in relation to its interaction with the wind and the built-in obsolescence of its concrete material versus discussing the anthropic quality of numerous city-bound kinetic works whose ideal form has been radically altered by nature and neglect.
Yeah. Thank you, Monica. There is no difference.
Okay.
Is the really short and easy answer to this. So the whole point of talking about the environment versus the question of the opposition between nature and culture is that the idea of nature is that it's somehow over there, right? Timothy Morton writes that nature's already here, right? It shouldn't be something that is constructed and set apart and put on a pedestal. So when one engages in environmental thinking, there's a sense of already being inside that which is other to oneself.
Like a container?
Yeah, also the environment is wherever we're embedded, right? It's the atmosphere as well. It's not necessarily thinking about going to nature. We're already in an environment, okay? So we're already there. So thinking about the environment helps us get beyond that question of campo-ciudad, the difference between city and urban cultures, and also invites us through infrastructure to think about these circulatory environments as linking cities to other types of materiality, okay, which others might call nature. So when you bring Gego into this, absolutely, I mean, the question of the materiality of these pieces is fundamental to thinking about their imbrication in environments. The environment is, the city, or it's the garden, or it's, the Orinoco Basin, but stuff happens to works. I think this is one of the things that's interesting to think about. It changes over time. And so the very fact of being in the city or being, as Otero's piece is, kind of peering over Guri, exposes these works to similar forces of entropy, change, abandon. So I think what I'm interested in doing with this kind of framework is thinking about those apparently remote spaces in the same methodological framework, if you like, and the fact of looking at Caracas's public artworks and seeing sprouting plants coming out of ultra-modern pieces, or rusting metal structures is the same phenomenon we might be witnessing with this steel sculpture standing in Guri.
Do they always imply the formation or, denigration of something that was, I mean, do they always imply deterioration, or do we, we think of them as a spiral jetty, right? Like, ebb and flowing and going underwater and emerging again, and that sort of that was, clearly part of the, that was a semi-conscious decision on the part of the artist. So do we think of these works as deteriorating, or is that just this anthropic aspect? I mean, how do we think about form if we take into account these contingent frameworks?
So if we think about Otero and Cruz Diez's works, they were absolutely not spiral jetties, right? They are supposed to remain intact. They're supposed to remain pristine, operational, functional, and yet, right, all of these other things happen at the same time. So I didn't even broach the question of politics and the politics of heritage and care for works. So there's a whole set of agencies there which are entangled, right? There's the artist agency in producing a work that is not meant to decay over time. There is the inevitability of decay through material processes. And then there's the question of who's the gatekeeper of heritage, right, in terms of helping things stay intact. So I think it's interesting to start to map out with these works what those agencies are, what are the time frames that they're happening in, to find new ways of talking about these works that hopefully kind of begins to connect these separate, apparently separate places, right?
Great. All right. Well, I'm gonna turn to this urban question with Marita. Continue with this urban question, and you guys can come back to at least if there's questions. So I'll circle back to this urban, Marita, with you. If I'm not mistaken, your train of thought is somewhere along the lines that in the magazine Conjugación de Buenos Aires, which was founded by two artists, concrete artists, in 1951, the editorial states an interest in, quote, testimonies of urban experience and the ideas and works of the aesthetic avant-garde. Then you add in your lecture that implies, that is, you say, the magazine sought to mix tango and inventionism. So my first question is if you can unpack a little bit this leap from urban experience, which actually I do associate with an aspiration to cosmopolitanism, to tango, about that leap from urban experience to tango. And I guess in connection to that, I wonder if La Madrid's statement from a few years before, quote, of all neorealist representative art, which is the opposite of inventionism, the only thing that interests me is tango, end quote. So I wonder if that is not instead a response to the ongoing conversation around the mythology of tango and the popular universe that was informing the works of painters like Berni. Surely, the concrete artists were closer to the Grupo Sur, which, has been accused of, the Revista Sur, and Victoria Ocampo, which, were a group of intellectuals that were seen as sort of elitist and surely not a bastion of popular culture. So I wonder if, you could expand a little bit on these. Poetic and literary intersection between La Madrid and tango. Was it, were there other cases? Was it, systematically addressed by other artists? Was there like a kind of sustained engagement with this vernacular?
Thank you, Monica. Well, I think that they, in the magazine, trying to mix this idea of tango and inventionism, of tango and avant-garde, because and this idea that the urban experience is tango is related because I think that they trying to think in this popular culture of the city, and the popular culture of the city in that moment was tango and the decades before. So I think that is the question related to why the magazine took this idea of tango as an urban culture, because it was the popular urban culture. And what I think that is more interesting to speak about in relation to what you are asking me is this idea of the crisis of tango during the 50s, and this idea that this typical motif of tango, that did not make sense anymore. For example, there are some typical motifs of tango, like the poverty, of the misery, that in all those tangos speaks about that. And if we consider that Berni's social policies change a lot the working class condition. So I think that those things related to the poverty or the poor mother and all those things that tango sings about did not make sense anymore during the 50s. Regarding Contreras and this part that he said in 1946 in this poetry supplement, that I think it is very interesting, because that means that in the very beginning of this avant-garde, inventionist avant-garde, this idea of tango was present. I think that is in relation with this character that is Contreras, that is a very atypical person in the sense that he was older than all the other guys of the group, and he was the person who, in one sense, was connected to the avant-garde, but did not forget the importance of trying to do this mix between popular culture and avant-garde or high culture. That in one sense, what I want trying to explain is that I think that our reading of Argentine concrete art privilege Maldonado's reading in many sense, and I think that is a good moment to rethink about that. And I think that this situation about Contreras and this popular consciousness is a good beginning to start to do this.
But he's not an isolated case? Did you see, when you were looking at this magazine or others, were there other instances, or was he like, do you think he's kind of like an exception, in looking at tango, or like an isolated case, or was there because, if you look at Revista A in Venezuela and Cruz del Sur, another important magazine from the 50s, there is a plethora of references to architecture from the Amazons, or and just ceramics and popular culture, all kinds of, and that was part of a kind of sort of post-colonial project, right? Like, looking to the immediate environment, circulatory environment, to kind of counter this sort of culture of importation. That was a big issue. So I wonder if there was a kind of agenda like that among these artists. I mean, I'm thinking of the concrete and concrete and inventionist artists. Was there a kind of post-colonial, agenda, like looking at, or is he an isolated kind of case?
I think that as we know, this reading about inventionist and concrete art, they didn't speak about local culture. There is any mention in Vision, there is any mention. I think that this is the only mention that it appears in those magazines, that those groups. I couldn't understand very well what you asked about Sur. Of course, Sur speaks about that, but this is very different magazine and comes from another group that is quite opposite to the group of concrete art.
No, I was. Yeah, go ahead. I was talking about Cruz del Sur from Venezuela, not the Sur from
Sorry, I don't understand.
You want, is there a mic or?
Thank you, Monica. Well, I enjoyed the two presentations. For Lisa, I would say that since you are work on this at this moment, I thought there is an excessive belief in progress. And the two examples that you brought are very masculine, dealing with water, which is the power of the machinery, the phallic of the tower. And Sisu, the French philosopher, says that women are about liquidity, and men about solidity, the solid. It's solid not because of direction. It's solid because its roles in life tends to be stable, while women, they have many roles in their lifetime according to body. Okay? So I think this could be brought in. And if you read the psychoanalysis of water in Bachelard, he will say that water is feminine, except when it's masculine, when it's bad water. When it's bad water, it's masculine. Le tsunami. Okay? So I think those ideas, a certain phenomenology could be brought in. And the other thing is that a certain faith in progress could be opposed to contradictions. There is a need for a certain contradiction of this idea of progress that was so strong at that moment. So when we speak of ecology, I think of how the water killed species that disappeared with those artificial lakes. What territories of the Indians were invaded? I speak so strongly about this because of the Brazilian situation, which is very, very critical. No? So I think it would bring frontwards, you would advance. And for you, I say that I loved also your presentation. I'm very interested in the idea of the modern before modernism. And my question is the vernacular a certain avant-garde? Because you speak about the transformation of music with tango. In Brazil, we could speak of the certain rhythm, and I'm a little bit tense, and so I tend to forget. But I can speak of Ernesto Nazaré. He made the Brazilian tangos after the Argentina and Uruguay. But when Darius Milhaud, the French avant-garde composer, came to Rio, he arrived in the city on the Saturday of Carnival. And in 1920, he had already written a history of modern music in Brazil, published in France. Okay? And that was Ernesto Nazaré. In Recife, we had the modernization of vernacular music with the frevo, leaving behind and in Rio we had the machixe, a composition which was very in style in Paris in the 10s, and the main composer was a woman, Chiquinha Gonzaga. So we are speaking of a certain avant-garde in popular music, which I loved. And my question to you was that where this relationship that we are establishing between tango and constructive geometric abstraction, if you could expand to Maria Fuchs, the dancer, the choreographer, who formed a whole generation of Argentinian dancer with avant-garde, and that group comes up to Cuitica through family relationships. So I think you have there a very interesting genealogy of lines to develop.
See if anyone else has a question. We can open it up. Yeah, you have. Yeah, here.
Hi, I just have a quick question for Maritza, which is there a sense in which the political affiliations of Maldonado and Invención, in the sense of a Marxist political affiliation, could find a way to think of tango and the popular in that sense? Because the political affinity was something that you didn't bring up, so I just wondered if you had thoughts about that.
Thank you, Irene, for your question. Well, I think that what is interesting that, as you say, during the 40s, the engagement with Marxism's ideas and the commitment with the Communist Party was very present. But I think that during the 50s, those ideas related, the engagement with political ideas, at least at Maldonado, for example, were decreased. But I think that it is interesting in the sense that took the tango, no, as a new possibility of political engagement, in the sense that this, as they say, a new collective adventure, no? The idea of collective adventure connect with this past, with this Marxism's past, but project in this during the 50s with these new ideas that were in connection with other politics, but were not in the sense of this orthodox Communist Party or Marxism, so perhaps close to Peronism also, and open in different ways. I don't know if I am be clear.
So just to come back to Paulo's point about the excessive faith in progress is not one I share, should say. And I'm not also sure that I share Bachelar's point on separating and gendering water in quite this way. Of course, it follows through Eastern thought, philosophy, and we may take it in that sense, but I'm not entirely comfortable either with that. That's not to say that this project doesn't have elements in it which are to do with the female body. So I work very closely with Carolina Caicedo's work, where in one of the pieces she makes this equivalence between the female body, its internal hydraulics and flows, and anti-contraceptive devices. So one of the pieces involves her removing her own coil and looking at this artifact and thinking about the way in which the regulation of the female body is in fact also a system of hydraulics, right? And how do we think about the gender politics of that as well? So I'm particularly interested in those things and in the phenomenological aspects of what water does, how it does it. And so I think you're absolutely right, this needs to be part of that project.
Yes, one question up there.
This is a question for Marita. regarding the cross-pollination between the vernacular and concrete and concrete invention, really. In the own historiography of music, there is this opposition. For instance, I interviewed Loza in '95, and he talks about Carlos Di Sarli eliminating the singer in 1942. So within the concrete artist, there is an idea that the main problem with tango was the voice and the lyrics, and appealing to a purity of the music itself. Loza talks about the angularity of Di Sarli's music, and then that thread is taken on by Schaffer and the emergence of concrete music itself. And later on, the person who takes on that nexus between concrete music and tango will be Mauricio Kagel. So I wonder if the historiography of music or musicology could be played out against this, because there's a striking back of the ideas of purity that you attribute to Maldonado within the development of the relation between tango, concrete music, and later Kagel. Just a counterpart. I'm not even a refutation of the argument. Simply that there is musicology behind this too.
Yeah, she called for muddy rivers or waters. So
right,
you know,
right. Sorry, I don't have a question. I don't have a question. I had a statement. I realized. I'm very sorry then.
One more question. We're done? Yeah, we're good. We're good. Thank you so much. Thank you, our speakers. We move on.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Lisa and Marita. We have a 10 minutes break, only 10 minutes. We have to come back later to watch screenings of 3 short videos by Rosana Paulino, Fernanda Gomez, and Marcelo Pombo, and after that to listen to Isaac Julien's presentation. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rosana Paulino, and I would like to comment some aspects related to concretism and the geometry in my country. Before to do it, I must say that I'm working with 2 series of collages that are called the Brazilian geometry, and the Brazilian geometry arrives at the tropical paradise, and where this work is that called my attention to geometric questions in Brazil. Talking about these tendencies in Brazil, I ask myself what kind of geometry these artists that worked with this proposed. Was it only an import from international movements? Did they look around the country before to do it? Did they look at the colors in Brazil, the nature, the people that lived here? One thing that caught my attention is the idea that it was possible to modernize the country adopting these ideas. It is like to say, okay, we are now a first world country. We can use geometry. I mean, it does not really consider the other possibilities for arts that we had in Brazil at that moment. Another thing that called my attention is the fact that we already had a geometry in Brazil. A geometry from indigenous people, from black people, these artists not considered it. For me, it looks like that they only imported the idea, but they did not try to put this together with an ancestral geometry that we had here. And finally, I'd like to point out what is in and what is out this idea of geometry that was developed here. The nature is out, the black people are out, the indigenous people are out. I'm thinking about what kind of country they were thinking when they used these tendencies, with for whom they produce it. It's a very serious question in a country like Brazil that used to despise the black and indigenous culture. And still today, Brazil is considered to have a geometric vocation. But about which Brazil we are talking about when we talk about this vocation? Looks to me that it was a very small group of artists to work with this and to represent a large country like Brazil is. Thank you.
A principios de los años 90, mi conocimiento del arte argentino era fragmentario y precario. Las pocas obras de arte madí, arte concreto, invención, con las que había tenido contacto, me inspiraron y me emocionaron. Eran obras pequeñas y modestas, y sabía que cada una de ellas había sido parte de una epopeya. Su tamaño reducido, su formato doméstico, coincidía con las condiciones materiales con las que yo hacía mi propia obra. También recuerdo que me llamaba la atención lo mal conservadas que estaban muchas de esas obras por aquellos años. Tenían manchas de dedos, bordes oscurecidos por el polvo, maderas arqueadas y curvadas, como si esos cuadros, objetos, testimonios de un arte de vanguardia, hubiesen incorporado y absorbido las marcas de la decadencia. Y por supuesto que todo eso me enamoraba. En los 90 yo hacía obras pequeñas, la gran mayoría basadas en formas abstractas y simples que no significaban nada, a las que yo decoraba con gotitas, monios y brillos que con el paso de los años se oscurecerían. Más adelante, en los años 2000, produje una serie de esmaltes en los que, a partir de esa inspiración en el arte concreto, fui más atrás en el tiempo y más lejos del centro. Mezclaba la geometría y el paisaje surrealista, como quien, partiendo de un arte más o menos contemporáneo y global, emprendiera un viaje a provincias más periféricas y contaminadas. Hoy, el arte concreto me parece profundamente nostálgico de un sueño de prosperidad y progreso que se derrumbó, que se vino abajo. Y tengo que confesar que me alegra inmensamente que esa fachada y hasta ese sueño se haya acabado, que se haya hecho visible la desigualdad, la deformidad, el provincianismo, la pobreza, que siempre han formado parte y siempre habitaron este continente. Un legado posible del arte concreto sería que los latinoamericanos, a pesar de vivir en sociedades con tanto contraste y contradicciones, tengamos el derecho a no explicarnos ni ser didácticos, digamos, hacia los demás y hacia nosotros mismos. Pero lo más importante sería la posibilidad de desarrollar un arte con una profunda conciencia política que no pase por lo temático, ni por la denuncia, ni siquiera por el mandato de la liberación, sino por el desarrollo de estrategias del goce, aún en la derrota.
In first place, there was a context. When concretism and neo-concretism developed, there was a great influence and inspiration of the ideals of the modern adventure. There was an ethical, statical vision of life and art, which I never understood how come people could give up. Even if it's a kind of utopia, why choose dystopia instead? In the same way, ethic and aesthetic merge. Form and content are the same in art. And I also never understood why people still makes the difference between them. And then the idea that visual language is not only autonomous, but powerful and, most important, liberating. There is no need of words. Maybe this is the most relevant part of this heritage, of abstract art as a whole, when we feel now that even in visual arts, verbal language dominates thinking. And it seems that people are not really interested anymore in thinking with images, objects, space, movement. There is no need of words or anything beyond work. To not explain what cannot be explained could be a real revolution in our world. It could even eliminate the overpower of religion. There are too many things that we can learn and play and create and feel with words. It's a wonderful realm of words. But it would be great if we could concentrate in these and let the much needed silence also exist.
The final participant today is Julien, the renowned British artist who does not require much introduction here in New York. Since his breakout film, Looking for Langston, which celebrated its 30th anniversary last year, Julien has developed a complex oeuvre that includes more than 30 works. Often conceived as multi-screen installations, his films frequently involve a documentary political dimension, tension through fragmented lyric narratives. We have invited Isaac tonight in order to introduce and discuss his recent work on Bo Bardi, one of the most important architects working in South America during the period that our research covers, with a practice that ranges from building to writing, editorial and curatorial work, education, furniture, jewelry, and exhibition design. In recent years, Bo Bardi's work has received much deserved attention, particularly because of the multiple ways in which her practice contested the modernist canon, acknowledging the multiplicity of Brazil's cultural and racial matrix, as well as its specific conditions of underdevelopment. Isaac's recent piece, titled Bo Bardi, A Marvelous Entanglement, follows a series of other projects in which he referenced the work of the architect. These include Stones Against Diamonds, Ice Cave from 2015, which features a series of homages to Bo Bardi's creations, and the installation of the film's Lessons of the Hour, which was exhibited at Metro Pictures Gallery in 2019, along with installations devices inspired by Bo Bardi's famous frames and pedestals. So without further ado, please join me in welcome Julien.
Thank you, Ines, and I want to say what an exciting moment this is, a real pivotal, exciting kind of new MoMA, and this expansion really is incredibly exhilarating, and listening to the papers was really fantastic, so thank you, and thank you for this kind of invitation. And what I'd like to do first is just to show you a clip, it's a kind of trailer of the work. So it just gives you a sort of introduction. It's very quick, and then I'll go into my paper. So when Lygia Bardi arrived in Brazil in 1946, her humanistic approach encountered a whole new cultural setting, one that was the inheritance and mixture of many different traditions and cultures, indigenous, European, African, and all constitutes of Brazilian popular culture. Brazilian modernism emerged from this cultural entanglement of productions from African and indigenous descendants, being disdained and imprinted with a sense of exotic folklore by an acknowledged slave-holding imperialist elite culture, whose intellectuality in turn was based on the requirements of imported theories from Europe and North America. This historical cultural power dynamic is paradigmatic of a history which feels very familiar to one, and deeply resonates with me because of my own Caribbean Southern background, so to speak, and my British background combined. And in a sense, I kind of remember the Nobel Poet Laureate Derek Walcott forewarning me after our collaboration on my film, Paradise Onerous, stating that we need to display the work both in St. Lucia, the South, and not just in the West. And of course, I was not able to do that. But in a sense, the underlying idea was that the cultural production is formed elsewhere than in the West, and that this is important to emphasize. Integrity accounting for the local, not in the sense of the folkloric, which Bo Bardi and Walcott detested, but in appreciating locality. This debate has informed the creation of several platform events, such as late Okwuezi's documentary 11, which was something that Bo Bardi seemed to be sensitive about, as she profoundly was critical of elite cultures, overlooking Brazilian culture's insipid potential. What Bo Bardi incorporated in her practice as an Italian architect was that Brazil was an example of organic cultural growth that she was already trained to see, so to speak, through her knowledge and relations between crafts, design, and labor in Italy. She saw that the diverse range of cultural products unique to Brazil, including music, food, the design of utilitarian objects, construction techniques, and in a sense, had been developed and refined through the colonization period, while most Brazilian cultural byproducts were seen by the intellectual elites as indistinguished and impoverished means of aesthetic purpose. And in a sense, I think this view obviously was bemoaned by both Walcott and obviously Bo Bardi and myself. And as I mentioned, he wanted to see Paradise Onerous exhibited in St. Lucia and stated his appall of the fact that there was no cultural program to support a piece to be shown locally, only tourist initiatives. But Bo Bardi started to fully acknowledge, I'd argue, the scope and the importance of Brazilian popular culture from the first time she visited Bahia in 1958. And of course, it's her creation of MAM, the Museum of Modern Art in Bahia, that she constructed her wonderful staircase, which, in a sense, utilized the making of ox carts and has been often used as a stage for performances. First, when I visited Bahia in 1996, it was these amazing stairs which I saw, and little would I know that 25 years later, I'd be collaborating with Ballet Folklorica de Bahia Dance Company in my purpose to propose to the choreographer, Zenebra, to create a performance specifically developed for that staircase, inspired by some black and white archival stills I saw at an exhibition at Saskia Pompeo on Lygia Bardi. Those stills showed a dance performance staged in Greek costumes, choreographed by Leah Robato, with performers casting their shadows on the Bardi stairs. Initially, my desire was to recreate Lygia's 1970s original performance, but this idea was transformed, just as it happens as many ideas are transformed when filming takes place. The architect was not alone in the urge to understand and invigorate Brazilian culture, identifying the potential of its pluralism. And of course, the urgency can be traced back to the groundbreaking the Modern Art Week in 1922 that reverberates in the works of filmmakers such as Globe Rocha or the French photographer based in Bahia, Pierre Verger. And if we take, as it were, the anthropophagic manifesto written in 2028, which is proposing the cultural cannibalism as a potential form of modern Brazilian artistic production, which should incorporate elements both of colonial and pre-colonial past in order to establish a post-colonial present, which would be unashamedly embrace diversity and synchronism as the core of its aesthetics. It was with this anthropologic Brazilian spirit that Lina Bardi decided to incorporate a prolific practice and elements that range from the colonial Baroque to modernism, brutalism, from popular artisanal crafts to classical painting. And it was with this spirit that we wanted to make our film a marvelous entanglement, having a kind of Bardi, of course, as our inspiration. So whether in designing this wonderful staircase, or creating the stage designs for theatre, cinema, or her exhibition-making practice, Bo Bardi was constantly seeking to bridge the gap between high and low cultures, and this cultural separation, which of course was established over the centuries by the Brazilian intellectual circles. Over 20 years, if we think back to this manifesto, while helping to cement its legacy, Bo Bardi worked with both Rocha and Verger on different occasions, including the shooting of that wonderful film, Black God, White Devil. And if we go even back to the São Paulo Fifth Biennale, you know, and how I'm going to quote, as it were, from a kind of important text, which I think sums a lot of Bo Bardi's thinking. So, a review of the country's recent history is emergent. The reflection upon Brazilian popular civilization is necessary, even if from the perspective of high culture, this reflection is not a reflection of the folklore always paternalistically supported by high culture. It is reflection seen from the other side. The reflection of the participant. It is the tin can leather man from the northeast. It is an inhabitant of the villas. It is the black indigenous. It is the mass that inverts and brings a contribution that is cumbrous, dry, and hard to digest. So in her attempts to establish these new modes of artistic production through an expanded notion of culture, whether in making popular art visible to elites or to high art, by making it approachable by the masses or to the masses, Lina Bardi created non-linear narratives in what she called a marvelous entanglement by constantly approximating these diverse universes in a Gramscian manner. Of course, if you think about Gramsci, the Marxist philosopher, he believes that all human beings are intellectuals, but not all of us occupy the place of intellectuals in society. In this, the prison notebooks, which Lina would note before the rise of dictatorship in Brazil in the 1960s, he argued that every type and layer of society has its own intellectuals, even if they do not fit the monopolized elitist modes of what an intellectual should be. Rather than looking at what the intellectual activity is, Gramsci places the intellectual among the activities performed by a certain group, taking into consideration the social relations embedded in it, concluding that they are no human activities in which intellectual participation is non-existent. In a marvelous entanglement, I want to relink this spirit of creating a fusion between architectural elements in which we create an assemblage of Lina's buildings, revisited not through the eyes of, say, an academic or a Bo Bardi scholar, of which I'm neither. All of that wonderful work has been done in the run-up to her 100th anniversary, which, for me, accumulated in opening in 2015 of the installation of her crystal glass easels and concrete plinths. And in a sense, to make a film installation, you have to encounter the other, so to speak, with your own tools, a process which involves a different kind of writing in the spirit of what Lina Bardi addressed in her important contribution, where she draws from a Gramscian perspective by calling the emergence of the new intellectuals who will be able to respond to the true culture, to life itself. So A Marvelous Entanglement wants to take this core as a multiple screen film essay, which was made over 6 years. It is hoped that the filmic approach might then stand a chance to meet with the likes of Brazilian anti-dictatorship militants from the 60s, including those of the filmmakers of Cinema Nova in what Italian philosopher defined as a national popular culture will. But Bardi went so far to compare the Brazilian deprived northeast regions with that of the Italian deep south, and this was one of the main reasons why, indeed, I chose to end up and to go back to the northeast region in The Marvelous Entanglement, rather than the spectacular but rather well-trodden curatorial route of Casa de Vidro in São Paulo, as an enchanting masterpiece as it is. I chose to focus on her public buildings, museums and theatres, and art centres intended, as it were, for community use, turning the Cuati in Salvador, of which we have this image here, into a modern ruin. And I've really been thinking about this question of concrete and nature. And I'm sure that Bo Bardi was rather conscious of this question of the ruination of buildings growing up in Rome, where she detested ruins, yet made this amazing structure, as it were, in her usual concrete style. So in a sense, this Salvadorian modern ruin becomes, as it were, my glass house, so to speak, and it may be seen as a symbolic space, which took me several years to get access to one of Bardi's, I would say, most enigmatic and visited buildings, and one that was created as a space for the public to use. Time is not linear. It is a marvelous entanglement where any moment points can be chosen, solutions invented without beginning or end is the motive of the film. So the whole question around temporality, around time, around narration, and thinking really about the kind of entanglements, the cultural, sort of both philosophical, but I think geographical, ethnic, gendered entanglements that Lina Bardi was really, I think, trying hard to, in a way, bring together. The Cuati would become a central architectural motif in A Marvelous Entanglement for me to experiment with Lina's ideas and words. They are doubly performed or re-echoed between both actors playing Lina in different stages of her life. We have, as well, Fernanda Montenegro, needs no introduction. I mean, the most amazing actor I've worked with, and her daughter, Fernanda Torres. And it's a returning to a location for reenactments and performances in the piece, and the space for, I would say, some of the most important artistic dialogues which made it possible for me to translate the extraordinary legacy of the visionary that Lina Bardi is into a filmic experience. Faster Multiple Screen has been filmed in several locations in Salvador, in São Paulo, and is driven by texts closely adapted by Bo Bardi's writing. It features acclaimed actresses, of course, Fernanda Montenegro and Fernanda Torres, who are arguably one of the foremost figures in the Brazilian arts, and thinking about, as it were, this question of mirroring time, stages in her life, mirroring her actions and movements. And as a central figure in Latin American modernism architecture, Bo Bardi devoted her life to working and promoting the social and cultural potential of art, architecture and design. And of course, Bo Bardi, who graduated from her architecture school in Rome before the Second World War, shortly after that became the editor of Damos magazine, and of course Habitat, the architect used to say that she started her career at a time when nothing was being built, only destroyed. After the Second World War, she married Petra Bardi, the couple moved to Brazil, and there Bo Bardi would find the elements that permanently would change her professional life and worldview, traveling to the northeast hinterlands, a region castrated by droughts, poverty, made Bardi bring the creative spirit of Brazilian folk cultures in a critical sense into a kind of dialogue with her practice through the building of furniture, jewellery, stage design, and in a sense, it was this interesting approach or theoretical approach to her work that one could argue Bo Bardi was able to bring high culture to masses and cultural awareness to the elites. Following Bo Bardi's footsteps over 6 years, I've created this multiple screen film installation, which is part homage, part poetic journey, that orbits around Bardi's life and work. It features artists and architects and scholars and personal acquaintances of Bardi, such as the actor and director Garcia, who knew Bo Bardi very, very well, and who recites a playful meditation on time on Bardi's text with Yolanda Negro at the finale scenes. These buildings are also the setting for performances of works by the Accra Collective and Ballet Folklorica de Bahia, symbolically celebrating the resurgent black culture of contemporary Bahia. And these performers also, as it were, revisit in a contemporary way, I would say, new audiences, and in a sense, I would argue that Bo Bardi would have been interested indeed in these audiences and artists herself, not just about satisfying high culture, but in fact always in dialogue with certain communities of the public. So in a sense, both inspired by official and anecdotal stories about Lina Bo Bardi's life and work, the film is shot across several buildings designed by Bo Bardi in Salvador, in Brazil, in the northeast of Bahia. And in a sense, the question of performance, intervention and enactment, and invention of scenes that have shaped the history and the legends around this architect, full of visual echoes and alliterations. The film focuses on key structural elements of Bo Bardi's designs, staircase, windows, wall openings, onto cityscapes, nature and sea as public spaces for a dialogic interaction and appreciation of art. It also reveals the fragile condition of many Bo Bardi's masterworks, especially those in Salvador, and the pressing need for conservation in a country where a fragile democracy tries to survive after a dictatorship that lasted many years, indeed in the midst of a second extreme political scenario, which echoes some of the political situations during Bo Bardi's own life. Marvelous Entanglement looks at Bo Bardi as a character whose voice can still shed light on issues that are so important to us today. Thank you. And this is just a clip of the free screen work, so you get an idea of the work. It's an abbreviated version of the 9 screen. Thank you.
Tá tudo pronto? Tá? Vou falar. 29, pronto? Terceira, câmera A. 131, primeira, câmera A. Casas ou museus? Primeiro as casas ou os museus? Tudo de uma vez só. As casas, tudo de uma só vez? As escolas, os museus, casas, as escolas, os museus, as bibliotecas. A planificação de uma cidade não pode esquecer dois edifícios públicos que ainda hoje são considerados um luxo intelectual. O museu e a biblioteca. Museu? Ó. A museu. O que é um museu? O que é um museu? Correntemente, quando se quer designar uma pessoa, uma coisa, uma ideia antiquada, inútil, fora de uso,
costuma-se dizer, ah, é uma peça de museu.
Costuma-se dizer, é uma peça de museu.
Querendo indicar com essas palavras o lugar que no quadro da cultura contemporânea o museu ocupa. Lugar poerento e inútil.
Lugar poerento e inútil.
O museu
moderno tem que ser um museu didático. Tem que juntar
a conservação,
a capacidade de transmitir a mensagem que as obras devem ser postas em evidência por parte do arquiteto,
que não deve aproveitar a ocasião para dar espetáculo em torno de si mesmo.
Fato. Qual a significação de uma peça isolada?
Uma obra de arte mesmo se exposta
assim
com a mais perfeita
técnica museográfica.
Se essa obra é fim em si mesma.
Se esta obra
isolada no tempo, no espaço.
Fim em si mesma.
Sem nenhuma ligação com o nosso
isolada
tempo,
no tempo e no espaço.
Sem continuidade histórica.
Sem nenhuma ligação com o nosso tempo. Sem continuidade histórica. Falei.
Thank you, Isaac, for sharing this with us tonight. And before open to questions from the audience, I would like to make you two questions. One about Lina and one about you. The one about Lina is the following. You've done films about, dedicated to specific figures. Frederick Douglass, Derek Jarman, Frantz Fanon, who else? Hughes.
Derek Jarman.
Excellent. So my question is for you is what links Lina to this pantheon of male figures, and what differentiates her as an artist and perhaps as a woman too? What brings her, what is she bringing to your pantheon of admired figures?
Well, I mean, I think in a way I'm very interested in figures that are, in a way, transnational figures. So if I take a figure like, say, Frantz Fanon, he's someone who was in Martinique, he went to France, he ends up in Algeria repudiating his Frenchness. But I think, and obviously the case of Frederick Douglass, he is a slave, African-American, he, in the mid-19th century, kind of becomes, well, slightly free. He moves to Scotland, becomes incredibly famous after writing his biography, and returns back to America as a free man. So, I mean, I think this question of movement is very attractive. So I think the idea of Lina Bo Bardi as a sort of emigre and a transnational figure, in a sense, that nonetheless is sort of coming to a sort of area and then, in a way, being able to view it and work with it in a particular manner. But I think, with Bo Bardi, there's this sense for me of the way then in which, in a sense, as a woman, she is, in a sense, perhaps moving, to a space where she can build. And within doing that, she is, in a way, very much looking at the sort of organic culture, as I'm arguing in this Gramscian manner, and trying to transform that and translate it into a space where it can be, where it can interpolate many different practices, and her very interdisciplinary approach to her own design work. So all of those things were fascinating to me, Bo Bardi. So she's a figure who is in this sort of international conversation and is playing this kind of rogue bourgeois person who goes to another culture, but nonetheless has this sort of critical dimension, you know, and is in a way in a position to view perhaps things as an outsider in a way perhaps that the people who are native are not in a way able to quite do, you know, because of her position, you know. So I think for me she's a fascinating sort of, you know, modernist carrier of these ideas and sort of aesthetic debates, and in a way is able to interpolate the culture almost with those.
And the question about you is the following. You worked about around 6 years about Lina Bo Bardi, studying her, doing research, filming her buildings obsessively. So I want to ask you, how did that work, that journey, influenced you as an artist? If it did, I hope so.
Well, I think, you know, that this dialogue with Latin American culture really transformed my sort of approach, both kind of curatorially, within my own work. I think there was a way in which it was really interesting for me to go, obviously, to Bahia, to the northeast, to see, you know, in a way through Bo Bardi's eyes, what she had done, and then to signify on that, and to make a sort of translation of that in terms of what Bardi would signify for a new generation, for Brazil today. So, and I think as well, I mean, in my own work, I've borrowed and adapted many Bo Bardi sort of scenographic practices. So, for example, the slide behind you was taken from my exhibition at Victoria Murray Gallery, where I've sort of utilized her hanging systems and utilized them also in my own studio. And then in a scenographic sense, I think the ways in which she was, in a way, deliberately tearing down sort of versions of the white cube and reinstalling that in with the crystal easels, this kind of, in a way, revolutionary way of displaying art. Of course, I mean, the trajectory of it, you know, Giponti, I mean, it goes back, but there's a sort of, nonetheless, a transformation of it. And so I was particularly struck also by the use of the performative, or how artists viewed her spaces. So the way that the stairs get transformed into a living stage. And, yeah, so, and then the question of conservation. What happens to conservation in her work when you sort of discover what I think is a sort of masterpiece, the Quati, but then it's there as this sort of, you know, but at the same time so resilient, you know, yeah. So I think, so that all of these things, you know, they're kind of, you know, the sort of Lina Bo Bardi rules, so to speak, that you can appropriate for one's own practice and way of thinking, in terms of both navigation, but also in thinking about display and exhibition making and one's own work. So, you know, the use of multiple screens, the idea of the verso, the backside, all of these, which were kind of these revolutionary ideas which were brought into contact with, in a way, Latin Americans for most country in terms of bringing these ideas to the fore in which she inhabited.
We are running out of time, so I will open the questions for the audience. Any questions?
So a couple of questions. One, I'm curious about the sound that you used. What decisions went into mobilizing sound in this particular piece, especially at the very beginning with the percussive sounds? It wasn't the beginning, it was the trailer, the beginning of the trailer. How did you organize the sound program? And secondly, huge lover of Bo Bardi. I'm not that familiar with her writings. Does she cite Gramsci?
Yes, she does. Yeah, and there's a way in which I think, you know, she's definitely reading prison notebooks. And I would say that, you know, in relationship to this kind of experience which she had in Bahia during the dictatorship, there's a way in which I think, in terms of my own experience when I was filming the work in Bahia, which was on the eve of this kind of political sort of change, there was a way in which one felt these, you know, I mean, so the question of music, of candomblé, of the Afro-Brazilian cultures and the way that those might signify the things which we were in conversation with. So, for example, the collective which I collaborated with, the Aka Collective, who situated themselves in the Kwati, in the building, and staged a number of performances which become part of reenacting the Bardi space. They read Bardi and were very interested in her notion of poor architecture, and that inspired their performance. And then usually in terms of music, I would work with soundtracks, you know, like 2 years in advance. So I'd work with different composers. And so in a way, when the work is being filmed, it already has a particular track. But what was really interesting in this one instance was that I participated in a workshop in Florida where I invited this collective, and they looked at parts of it and they went, no, you know, this music, you know, it has to have another type of, and so they made these sort of interventions. So it was really very interesting in terms of, you know, their relationship to sound and performance within their own works, and then that, how that interpreted my own practice and made a kind of intervention into how I would work. And so, but I would say that on the whole, that usually I try to work with soundtracks and scapes or soundscapes well in advance of shooting the work. So, and that involves a whole other research. Yeah.
Paulo has a question.
I really loved your presentation. And what I would like to point regarding history is that history makes sense when it gives épaisseur to the present. How to say épaisseur? Weight to the present. No? I wonder if you read Brodel on Bahia. Because a few years before Bardi came, there was the French mission to the University of São Paulo, bring Brodel, Lévi-Strauss, that would write the Tristopique 10 years later. And I felt that you had many layers of historicity. Because when Brodel writes about Brasilia, he said, usually the past explains the present. And here is the case where the present explains the past, Bahia. No? And you have those layers there. One of them are the windows at Coa TV. That's the Islamic tradition in Bahia, in Brazil. And Bahia is the center of the Islamic heritage of historically in Brazil. Frantz Fanon was very well read during the 60s by Oiticica, with whom she contributed, by Glauber. So when you mention Fanon, I think again we are speaking of layers of history. And this is not the opinion of this museum, it's my own opinion. You have somehow anticipated the terrible future which is the present of Brazil, with Bolsonaro. Those two artists are mother and daughter. Fernanda Montenegro was a candidate to the Oscar at the best for foreign actress. And the former Secretary of Cultura of Bolsonaro, who was so well quoted by Bolsonaro, Alvin, he abused of Fernanda Montenegro verbally, downgrading her. Bolsonaro himself has compared the quilombolas, which are the descendants of the quilombos, which were slaves that fled from the slavery and created. And still there are many quilombos around Brazil. For instance, in Rio, we have quilombos in the city. And he compared to cattle by weight. Okay? So everything is there. As your work is bringing in how the present explains the past, and you has this terrible radar that makes this work so important for contemporary Brazil. Thank you for bringing this.
Excellent. I think there is another question, I think the last one, because we will have to leave after that. Sarina.
Yes. I wanted to ask you, since you had this fantastic film that you made in China a few years ago, and your exploration of all the culture in China compared to the culture in Brazil. Is there a comparison? How did you feel about exploring both in depth?
Well, I was thinking about this. I was thinking about, the amazing, scholarly papers, that we've heard today, and I was then thinking about one's own practice, where, of course you're interpolated by these papers to a certain extent, but then there's a third thing that you have to be involved in as an artist, which is called field work to a certain extent. And I would say that, there are things in the making of 10,000 Waves which allowed me to have, if you like, the apparatus for, working in Brazil. But of course, in a sense, when 10,000 Waves was shown at Sesqui Pompeia, there was this kind of meeting, you could say, between the sort of scenography of that work as a 9-screen work, which, of course was shown here and, very much, supported by Glenn. And it was very exciting as an experience. And when we showed it in São Paulo, this kind of synergy that began with Bo Bardi's kind of, scenographic practice. And so, in a sense, of course, there is a kind of strong Asian culture in Brazil as well, and I have, a Japanese, Brazilian sort of curator who works in my studio, and so in this question of intercultural sort of mixing, which one, in a way, can take for granted, but I think, in a sense, Bo Bardi, never did, but was really at pains, I think in her own way, trying to introduce these important dialogues in modernism. I think, for me, it's that question of, her place in that sort of dialogue, and then the sort of unfinished business of those aspects, So, so there's a way in which one work, which is 10,000 Waves, looks at Chinese culture as a very ancient culture. We're obsessed with migration in Europe, but they've been traveling for thousands and thousands of years, versus then, a culture which is a completely migrated culture, which, disavows its, organic indigenous cultures, so to speak, and what that produces. So it produces these interesting tensions and dynamics, I think, of which we've been discussion, I think, this
Yes.
evening.
So thank you, Isaac. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for all the presentations. And we will see you tomorrow at 1 o'clock in Columbia University to continue these exciting conversations. Thank you.